All right. Um, hey, welcome, guys. I've been reading Nietzsche, obviously, um, but I want to read these like two sections um, because I think there's like a lot to think about, and I'm still thinking them. I'm trying to think them through a little bit more. But Nietzsche, he's like, I don't know. It's interesting, but to think about beings as illogical, and then beings as necessarily or inescapably, maybe not necessarily, but perhaps they're the same for Nietzsche. Um, Injustice. Um, so I'll read this two passages where Nietzsche talks about us being illogical beings, and then how we're also kind of beings of injustice. All right. So Nietzsche says here, he goes, among the things that can reduce a thinker to despair is the knowledge that the illogical is a necessity for mankind, and that much good proceeds from the illogical. It is implanted so firmly in the passions, in language, in art, in religion, and in general in everything that lends value to life, that one cannot pull it out of these fair things without mortally injuring them. Only very naive people are capable of believing that the nature of man could be transformed into a purely logical one. But if there should be degrees of approximation to this objective, what would not have to be lost if this course were taken? Even the most rational man from time to time needs to recover nature, that is to say, his illogical original relationship with all things. So this is a really interesting thing, because Nietzsche is almost saying like any value that we place on things actually is fundamentally rooted in a sort of like illogical way of being. Like, I would say this, like, the ground for value might have to be illogical, in the sense of that if it were logical, then perhaps we would come up with the same values. But because as beings we don't value the same things, well, that kind of changes the ground, and that also changes the way we think about logic. So again, if as beings we had the same values, then perhaps beings themselves would be fundamentally logical. But like, Nietzsche's not saying that. Nietzsche's saying like, well, actually, everything you love, adore, art, religion, everything that you value actually has its ground in something illogical. But he calls that like as the original relationship to like all things. And I think this is really fascinating in some sense, um, because you could say, like, maybe like going back to like the Christian myth of just like, well, they always call it like the tree of knowledge of like life and death. Um, but that would mean that if the tree, right, has this knowledge of life and death, um, then, or just calling it the tree of knowledge, then actually everything outside the tree, outside its perimeter, outside its own being, would be the lack of knowledge. It would be something perhaps illogical, or the original nature of things. Um, but Nietzsche is saying like everything we value is grounded in the illogical nature of things, and that's the original relationship to things. So art, religion, etc. And this is fascinating because he's saying even if we could be fully rational beings, we would have to recover from time to time, because it would seem like rationality would sicken us. We would become sick. We would have to recover by being with things that are illogical. But I'm gonna read the next passage where he titles it "Injustice Necessary." And he says, "All judgments as to the value of life have evolved illogically and are therefore unjust." So now he's like connecting his notion of like where values come from, which is illogical, our original sort of relationship with things. And then he's saying like those judgments as to the value of life have evolved illogically and are therefore unjust. So by virtue of being illogical, it's unjust. And this is interesting to think about, because it's like, okay, well, why is logic for Nietzsche affiliated with justice, like thinking logically? But like it also, you could say like it makes sense, like should justice be logical? And like this is a question that like is being raised, I would say. And he continues, he goes, the falsity of human judgment derives firstly from the condition of the material to be judged. So like the material to be judged, meaning we probably work with impartial information, or like not impartial, but partial information, namely very incomplete. Secondly, from the way in which the sum is arrived at on the basis of this material. And thirdly, from the fact that every individual piece of this material is in turn the outcome of false knowledge, and is so with absolute necessity. Our experience of another person, for example, no matter how close he stands to us, can never be complete. So actually Nietzsche really is talking about, in some ways, what Daniel Gardner has come up with, like the idea of like partial objects can never be complete, so that we would have a logical right to a total evaluation of him. All evaluations are premature and are bound to be. Finally, the standard by which we measure our own being is not an unalterable magnitude. We are subject to moods and fluctuations, and yet we would have to know ourselves as a fixed standard to be able justly to assess the relation between ourselves and anything whatever. Perhaps it would follow from all this that one ought not to judge at all, if only it were possible to live without evaluating, without having aversions and partialities. For all aversion is dependent on an evaluation. Likewise, all partiality, a drive to something or away from something, divorced from a feeling one is desiring, the beneficial or avoiding the harmful, a drive without some kind of knowing, evaluation of the worth of its objective, does not exist in man. We are from the very beginning illogical and thus unjust beings, and can recognize this. This is one of the greatest and most irresolvable discords of existence. Okay. So that's interesting. So he's saying, once we realize that we are illogical beings, because by virtue of the way we value, and by virtue of the way we value, because it's illogical, it's also unjust, or it's unjust, as he says, injustice. And actually, it would be interesting to explore like this difference between injustice and unjust, because he doesn't say unjust, he says injustice, but also understands translation. So there's that. But what's interesting is he says at the bottom that we can recognize this. But now I'm curious, which is, if we recognize this as beings, like, would we as beings be more aware? Like, is for Nietzsche, in this case, being more aware of how unjust we are as beings? Because if we realize, and like this is something, because like I know Daniel Gardner comes up with this difference between like there's like rationality, irrationality, and then there's like the non-rational. Nietzsche obviously is not working with that paradigm, but like I think obviously something like the non-rational would be helpful here. But also at the same time, um, if we were just to entertain these two dichotomies between logic and illogical, and then justice and injustice, then what's interesting is that if we entertain this, like if we were to accept this from Nietzsche, that we are illogical beings and that we are virtually by this unjust beings, like what would this do? What would this do to us as beings? Like, would there be, in some sense, a world that is more understanding, more loving of the other as such? Like, I mean, obviously Nietzsche is not implying any of this, but like just thinking it through of like the consequences of this. And like there is a line, an aphorism in Beyond Good and Evil where he says, love is beyond good and evil. Like he quotes it. He goes, beyond good and evil. Um, and like when we think about this, like love would have to be that very thing. And it's actually very funny because like even the trope about love is that like, well, it's very irrational and it's illogical. You know, I'm like, this is the trope about it, right? Like you do stupid things for love and it makes you blind, and so on. Like this is just like the movie tropes and stereotypes about it. But even if we entertain like such a trope, um, it would seem then like that's the only way possible to be. That's the only way of being that accepts the illogical nature of man and the injustice that is inescapable. But also, just to connect it back to the first passage, where he's like, well, actually, connecting with what is illogical is actually connecting with art, with religion. And like, it's very funny that he actually says language, passions, and religion. And though he's very critical of Christianity, I think it's because he's critical of Christianity precisely because, like, well, in his mind at the time, like Christianity has a kind of monopoly on like morality. But what's interesting, and like this is something that like I'm still exploring because obviously All Too Human is like an earlier text from Nietzsche, which is like, does Nietzsche necessarily exclude religion as such? Or does Nietzsche want us to understand that when we involve ourselves in religion, it's not an absolute truth. It's actually just a perspective. It's just a mode of being. It's just a story that we've chosen to follow, chosen to be. Because in that sense, that would remain true. Like, I think I would interpret this like, I think I would say Nietzsche would be fine with any religion that understands itself virtually to just be illogical and perhaps inescapably unjust, because he's already saying that beings themselves are unjust and we can't escape this. But it's like, but doesn't that change the relationship to things if we accept as beings? Like, here's the thing that I'm willing to entertain is like, if we accept as beings that we're illogical and that at the ground we're inescapably unjust, like, does that change the qualitative relationships that we have with beings and ourselves versus believing that we're actually doing good and change? Like, basically what I'm trying to raise the question is, do we inherently commit more injustice by claiming that actually we can eradicate injustice, that it is solvable, it can be eliminated, and that actually illogicalness can be also eliminated by being more logical? Like, this is the question that's very interesting to me, because it's like, if we accept that we are as Nietzsche is pointing out, that we are illogical and inescapably unjust. I feel that if we were aware of this as beings, it would change our relationships to being itself, where perhaps it wouldn't be necessarily like, would it be more just by realizing this, by just being aware of this pathology within beings themselves? Like, would we be ironically more just this way? Because the alternative, and Nietzsche is really posing this interesting alternative, because he's saying, like, well, if we are logical only, and if the ground of values are logical, and if by virtue we can be just and injustice can be eliminated, is there this irony where we do commit more injustice because actually, and this is Nietzsche's argument, that actually the ground is illogical? So, like, here's the questioning of the ground, because if the ground is actually illogical for values and judgments, and by virtue that means we're working with partial information, which by virtue means we're also committing injustice, because injustice would mean that actually we're not able to give account for everything. And you're really getting an understanding of Nietzsche's definition of justice here, because giving being able to give justice to something is to be able to account for the whole, but you can't account for the whole. So by virtue, you are committing injustice because you can't account for everything. You're working with partial information. And then you yourself also have your own moods, fluctuations, biases, inclinations, disgust, passions, and so on. So, but if we were aware of this, would we be able to be, as beings, more just by understanding this inescapable nature? I think there's an argument that perhaps we can be, ironically, more just by being aware of our inescapableness to partial objects, right? Like, this is something like Daniel Garner would say, like, in terms of just like partial objects exist. But the thing is, like, because we lack the awareness to know that we're working with partial objects, partial information, judgments, and so on, that actually the situation that we find ourselves in is ironically committing more injustice as such, by virtue of thinking that injustice can be eliminated. Like, this is the thing that's like very interesting to like even think about, because you start understanding like Nietzsche's definition of justice, because justice for him must be, I think, if we're reading the passage carefully, is saying like, okay, well, justice can only be done if we're taking account of everything, the whole, everything. But I think we some ways realize like we can't. So is there really any room for us to be proud of ourselves for committing good things or committing justice for things and beings? And this is also really interesting because like when you compare it to like the Christian myth, like Nietzsche's almost saying like, yeah, this is like the original sin of being. Like the fact that actually your values, and like if I were to say like Nietzsche has like a concept of original sin, I would say like, actually what's interesting, because if you go back to Twilight of the Idols, it's like an original innocence, but like the original innocence itself is illogical and unjust because it's innocent, like it doesn't know. And that's a really interesting paradigm to pair with versus like maybe perhaps the Christian original sin, where it's like actually you did something wrong, so now you have to like in some sense live with this thing, like Adam and Eve did what they did, and now we all kind of like have to bear with this kind of privation or lack of being barred from the original, Eden and all that stuff. But one probably could argue that like Nietzsche has almost like an original sin, but this original sin wouldn't be original sin, but like an original innocence to things. And like, but in some sense, like that's also very similar to the Christian myth, because like before Adam and Eve, like, did the whole apple thing, like there was an original innocence. But like you could also interpret that as like the whole interaction, right? The original innocence ironically involved eating the apple, right? Because Nietzsche's understanding would be, well, actually, like our values and our judgments are partial, illogical, because actually when you think about it, like if we knew the cost, right, of the Christian myth of the apple, I mean, it's not an apple, it's like a fruit. I mean, we don't actually know if it's an apple, but it's like a fruit, it's a fruit. Um it's just always depicted as an apple in like paintings and stuff sometimes. But yeah, it's a fruit. So anyways, like we would argue like, okay, well, like no rational human being would do this if they knew the consequence, right? But anyways, I don't want to go too deep into that. But yeah, it's interesting. Like Nietzsche's idea of like justice is like seems to be like the totality of the account from which we cannot ever take account. So that means in some sense, we're in justice. We're in the whole. Like you can find this in Twilight of the Idols. Like this is where like Nietzsche is also saying like the innocence of becoming, because like we're in the whole. And because of that, we can't judge the whole because we're inside of it. Like we can't go outside of it. Like Nietzsche's understanding, I like the way he's thinking. Like the way he's thinking is, well, you can't actually judge what's inside because you're involved in it. Like you're a part of it. You're the being in it. Because if you could judge it, that means you would be exterior to it to be able to look at it and judge it completely, but we can't. So you're actually always working with the partiality of it because you're in the whole. And this is where it starts sounding like you're in the whole, like HOLE versus WHOLE. But like Nietzsche definitely is talking about the WHOLE. But if you're in the WHOLE, in the whole, then like ironically, you're also in the whole, like HOLE. Because then you can't actually judge from outside. But what's interesting is that Nietzsche doesn't say that you can't judge from inside, because, and this is the thing that he says too, where like you'd be tempted to then not judge at all, but like actually as beings, you cannot help but judge. So like because of that, it like by virtue unjust. Like that, and that's fascinating actually. But the question that's like really posed for me is, okay, well then what do you do as beings then? Right? Like if Nietzsche is correct, let's just say Nietzsche is correct. Like what do we do as beings from there? And I would say, like, I think like if we take Nietzsche seriously, like I think it would actually change our relationship to ourselves and other beings. Because then you'd be working with like a kind of like maybe like a humbleness, perhaps, of just like realizing like, okay, like, yeah, like my values, the ground of them are illogical. And I know when I judge, like there's a certain degree of injustice to them. And so like Nietzsche, I would argue from here is opening the way of an ethics of the other from which you cannot calculate. And like this is like interesting because this is where like I think the avenue of like the philosophies of like Levinas and like Buber, for example. And like Buber was a big reader of Nietzsche. So like I actually do think when I'm reading Nietzsche, I'm like, okay, I definitely see how like Derrida is also influenced by Nietzsche. Like these ideas of like difference and the other become serious ethical questions, because if you try to calculate, that means you're working with some standard measurement, then you're missing the whole, and that means you're doing an injustice to the other. And so like all these competing, so now we all have all these competing values or philosophies of like how to encounter the other. And like I've always liked Buber's approach, because Buber's approach was like, well, you cannot encounter, like you cannot choose to encounter the other, and you can only position yourself in a way to just encounter the other, and like that's it. You can't do anything else, because doing anything else would imply a missing of the possibility to encounter the whole. And so like this is, you could say like these are the philosophies that come after Nietzsche, where it's like and I would say from Buber, like I don't know too much about like Levinas and all them, but like Buber specifically would be like, yeah, we fundamentally, like Nietzsche's world that he's depicting is like the I it world of Buber, but like the I thou world, which is included in the I it world, is that you cannot attempt to encounter the other through anything that you have. So it's a complete vulnerability, complete surrendering, complete being, complete letting be. And like Nietzsche, like you can argue in Nietzsche's philosophy, like there is a letting be, like love of one's fate and all that, love what is necessary. Like, but like obviously, like Nietzsche doesn't go too much into like how to encounter the other, but like you can start to see like how this becomes possible. Like how people like Heidegger, Martin Buber, Levinas starts coming up with philosophies, and Deleuze actually too, of like this radical thinking about like, okay, how do we think about beings? How do we think about encountering difference? And so like I would say Nietzsche radically opens up what Daniel Gardner is calling like a kind of like encounterology of being. Like how do we encounter beings then? Knowing all of this that we know, like Nietzsche is laying, in my opinion, like the framework for this. Like he's breaking open the ethics now for how to encounter beings in their being. And like there's disagreements now about that, but like you can see now like that Nietzsche really, in my opinion, is the maker of this breaking of like how do we encounter beings in their being. And like I think Heidegger was a really good reader of Nietzsche in this case, because obviously like there's a lot of letting involved. But like when we compare like Martin Buber and Heidegger, for example, like they did disagree on like certain philosophies of like language, but like again, like but their philosophy is a kind of like encounterology a little bit. And like in my case, like I don't know too much about Heidegger, but like I have read some, but like Buber I've definitely read. Like Buber, I would say like definitely is involved in that kind of like encounterology of ethics. So I mean, but there is just a lot to think about in that case, if Nietzsche is correct. But like you could say, and I could argue, like, yeah, I think a lot of thinkers that read Nietzsche were agreeing with that, like Deleuze, Martin Buber, Heidegger, and all of them. Like I would say, like I can definitely see all their philosophies coming from Nietzsche. Like I can literally see it when I read Nietzsche. I'm like, okay, like I get it. Like I can literally, and it's crazy seeing like how they saw it. Because I can see it. Like I can see it knowing some familiarity with their philosophies. But yeah. And anyways, that's just thoughts. So okay. Thank you guys for watching. Okay. Bye.